What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Now, this particular game is very interesting for a lot of reasons. For starters, you cannot get this game on Steam. You can only find it on GOG. Despite doing some research into the reason why that is, I cannot find anything concrete. But for whatever reason, you can only find this game on GOG. And I mention that specifically because I tend to 100% a lot of games, and I have a public Steam profile to prove that, which I'll usually refer people to if they want to see like playtime, achievements, whatever. But in this particular case, that's kind of impossible. Moreover, I am playing the game with the Circle of 8 mod pack, because Temple of Elemental Evil is one of Troika's games. Troika is a defunct company that made 3 very cult classic games, including Temple of Elemental Evil, but unfortunately, all of them suffer from a great amount of bugs, etc. All 3 of those games basically require a sort of unofficial patch to make them playable and compatible with modern hardware, and a lot of times even with those patches, they can still be a little choppy. So I'm playing with the version of Circle of 8 that just fixes all of the bugs, doesn't really add any new content, though that kind of thing is available if you want it. So just throwing that out there. But some other reasons Temple of Elemental Evil is very interesting. The game uses D&D 3.5 edition, which is unusual. You don't see a lot of 3.5 edition video games. It's pretty much this and Neverwinter Nights 2. The original Neverwinter Nights used 3rd edition, and then of course the Pathfinder games use a rule set that is heavily based on D&D 3.5 but is a bit different. However, because of my familiarity with the Pathfinder games especially, but also the fact that I played some of the tabletop D&D 3.5 in high school, I'm very familiar with this rule set, which makes jumping into the title quite easy for me, actually. So I'm hopefully not expecting to spend too terribly long on this particular review. Which brings me to some other points about Temple of Elemental Evil. It was originally a module released for the tabletop setting in 1985. However, that tabletop module actually used Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules, not 3.5. However, nonetheless, because of this, if you're familiar with that module at all, or you just Google it, you can basically figure out the entire plot of Temple of Elemental Evil. And it's relatively short. Most of the game takes place inside of the temple, with the first parts of the game taking place a bit across 2 villages that then lead you to the temple. And that's important because the way you approach this title is largely down to your party's alignment, meaning that there's I believe it's 6 or 7 different openings to the game depending again on what the overall alignment for your party is. As in this particular game, you can't really have evil characters hanging out with good characters. All of the party members are required to be within a certain alignment of each other, and then your party alignment dictates the opening. Now, truthfully, this doesn't affect too terribly much in terms of the overall game, but it will very much so change the start of what you're doing, which is interesting because that's something Origins played around with to a much greater degree, that is to say Dragon Age Origins, and it's interesting to see this very early CRPG kind of play around with that same idea, even if it is to a lesser degree. And then just some general observations. I'm surprised about the size of the maps in this particular game. The actual scope of the areas that you load into is very substantial, which I wasn't really expecting from an older title like this. However, that is hampered by the fact that Temple of Elemental Evil has the single worst pathfinding I've ever played in a CRPG. Which is saying something because pathfinding in these isometric games is notoriously bad, just in general, but Temple here really takes the cake because wow, it is terrible. And then from there, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the very interesting Radial menu that they use your commands from. D&D 3.5 and thus Pathfinder is very rules heavy. So they kind of categorized all that with this kind of strange Radial menu that you don't really see anywhere else in games really. And it's hit or miss. On one hand, I kind of enjoy it, especially knowing as much about this rule set as I do, all of the options that I'm looking for are there. But on the other hand, sometimes the words are at a 70-degree angle and it feels ridiculous. Resting is a little bit restrictive. You can only rest in certain safe areas and you'll see the rest icon where it's available. So you can't just rest all of the time, but there's no time limit on anything, so you can just kind of travel back to where it's safe to rest and then rest there. And moreover, the game actually focuses on a sort of fast travel system, so you don't really have to worry about rations or feeding all your guys, or really getting exhausted or anything like that, as the game definitely simplifies a lot of the rules around traveling, etc., presumably just to make it easier to play. Combined with the fact that there's really only one difficulty for the game. There is an Iron Man mode, but this game is notoriously bad at corrupting save files, and an Iron Man mode with one save file is thus a poor idea, frankly. And you can tell they put a lot of emphasis on trying to get people into this title in terms of making it easier to play through. Again, interesting because they chose to use D&D 3.5, which is a very rules-heavy edition of D&D. So again, just one of the many oddities about this game. And the last thing I want to mention, when you're playing through this game or creating your characters, you might notice that you don't recognize the names of deities and stuff, and that is because Temple actually takes place in the Greyhawk campaign setting. And for the people who are more familiar with 5th edition D&D, you might not know about Greyhawk because current D&D uses the Forgotten Realms as the default setting, which is often relegated to the Sword Coast even. However, one of the original campaign settings for D&D was actually Greyhawk, which is a separate world with its own deities, etc. And 3rd edition in particular actually used Greyhawk as its kind of main setting, which is just an interesting note when you realize that they scrapped the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules that were originally part of this module and pulled in the 3.5 rules from the edition that used this setting as a sort of default setting, if you will. But there you go, guys. I'll save some stuff for the review. But overall, my first impressions of Temple of Elemental Evil is that it is such an interesting game in so many ways, from its approach to the setting itself, and I'm really looking forward to diving into it. Now, I don't know exactly when I will have this particular review up. It'll probably be a week or two at least. I do have some other stuff I have to take care of in the meantime. But overall, very excited to dive into this one. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.